in my own personal work, I'm continuing to try to create better urban theory, better ways of understanding how cities actually operate and what are the processes that create and sustain and cities and allow for human development and economic growth. I think the sort of the sum total of a lot of this work that many people are now doing, but that we understand increasingly better in terms of data and models, is that cities really have this different logic from many other human systems in that they create this opportunity for non-zero-sum games, so essentially the opportunity for people to work together and create value for everybody. And that's really transformative, and we now see it throughout the world. So it's a very exciting time where this different logic of how we co-create knowledge, how co-create better societies, civic societies, as well as economic value are playing out everywhere. So an idea somewhere can really blow up and exist throughout the world in fascinating ways. I think what the New Urban Agenda, even the Sustainable Development Goals and several of the other international agreements have created, is that I think they created in the political realm a change of perspective that's very important. I think it has two main components. One is that we have now a number of quantitative objectives that we can kind of aim for. You know, that simplifies the problem a little bit. You have to take that carefully, but nevertheless, I think it's important. There's sort of a timeline and a set of targets. But the more interesting part, I think, for cities and how we understand them and act in them is really to do with this shift in perspective to, as you said, the idea that cities are fundamental social networks of people that need to have agency and be able to act to both in their own self-interest and interest of their own networks to create a civic space that's better for everybody. And this idea is very powerful. It's not always been there in terms of how we create our societies, and then more specifically, how is it that this plays out? And the fact that now we have sort of an international political document that says that this is the way cities work, and let's ride this kind of logic and dynamic to create a better world for all, is really transformative. I think we're still struggling with what that means and how to do it in detail. Public spaces are central. I mean, in many ways, you can think of cities ultimately are really about a bunch of strangers coming together to do difficult things that are very contested and that require sort of continuous interaction and a set of rules and spaces that allow that to happen. And public spaces are a very visible and very important part of where those encounters and those negotiations and those both serendipities and then organizations come to be done. I think that in the work that you're doing, but also increasingly as we think about this, these contexts and new ways of thinking about cities, we think about public spaces for what they do, right? Not just sort of as places that we build in certain specific ways, which we've had now for a long time. There are recipes to do that, but in terms of their quality, how they bring people together, how people feel in them, how open to different kinds of people and different kinds of interaction they are. And I think from that perspective, there's a whole set of renewed enthusiasms as to how we design the city around, again, human and social dynamics and what that means for the built environment. And public spaces are really very central to, as sort of, sometimes the first places, the places also where you see cities and you feel them and you feel what's possible. So I think the questions about how public spaces work, but more generally how the city works as really these networks of people and institutions that happen over spaces with different characters, is just an idea that's becoming clear to people. I think we all have an intuitive sense of it because most of us live in cities and have that experience. But this is really the difference, I think, between what you may say science is, sort of fundamental knowledge that we finally are self-conscious and have a way of describing how cities work, and sort of a more parochial, more accidental perspective of how things are and how we design from this other perspective. So I think the difference at the moment is that maybe for the first time we really can look at almost any city in the world and see communalities. We are here in Kuala Lumpur, but we could be in a city in the United States or Sweden, and we can see how cities are growing, how their built environments are similar even though they're in different climates, how people need places to meet and and exchange ideas as well as have fun and do all kinds of things that people do together. And so I think that these things that used to be in the realm of just politics or just improvised kind of planning and design are finally becoming better understood, more comprehensive. And that means that we can act at a different level. We can act at the level of understanding the function of these spaces and of the city rather than this explicit designs, which are a little bit more circumstantial and driven by budgets and technologies and things like this. So I think what's very exciting is that the world of urban design, including of public spaces, is opening up as a set of possibilities, both conceptually in terms of the technologies and places where they happen. And from that perspective, I think it's a great time to think about the idea of public space, writ large. This almost conflict, this tension, I think is a better word, between bottom-up and top-down in design is so important in all complex systems like a city, because both happen and are important. But in many ways, it's true that every complex system, every city, has a lot of, let's call it bottom-up design, but let's just say what that is, right? It's the hustle of people every day living somewhere, going about their lives, doing the best they can. And that creates both places, public spaces, streets, and then it creates networks of interaction, jobs, institutions. And all this happens most of the time without explicit design. There's a lot of it anyway that happens without explicit intention and design. And that's the nature of the city. Many cities that are very informal. A city, I don't know, like Lagos in Nigeria, which is enormous now, about 20 million people. It's a very informal city. It's a real city. It's a city of people, of markets, of opportunity, though it has many of the challenges also associated with informality. Having said that, the way we've thought a lot about planning in the past, in the 20th century in particular, has been to think about the city being ordered by a master plan, by having essentially the idea that usually a person, but a team of people come in and order space, and this solves all the problems of society and of the economy and so forth. And we know now that that's not true, but I think at the same time it's important that there are some collective top-down coordinating mechanisms, both spatial and institutional, that, for example, allow transportation through the city. Where the city is very congested, you need to have fast ways through. That's an obvious thing to say. Or that help us to make sense of the built environment and not have that every piece of the built environment is designed by a single person, which creates a lot of conflict and issues that don't scale up in terms of function. And then I think less tangibly, but almost more importantly, is in some sense the rules of the game, the institutions, both in terms of people's beliefs, but also in terms of how a city works for all. This has to do with justice, it has to do with government and bureaucracy and governance, it has to do with the ability of people to act in a city with strangers and have opportunity and have being able to realize their aspirations in a way that everyone has a good opportunity to realize their ideas and their ambitions. And it's no accident, I think, that a lot of the words for politics, for civic, are all city words, right? They all have a root in city, either in Greek or Latin. So the city is the place where these things, these tensions between top-down and bottom-up are fought, and where some of the things go from the level of a single person, where they fundamentally happen, to becoming a collective expression of our societies and setting up the rules of the game that then allow people to function even better, or at least to not have to worry about certain things like conflict resolution so much as they would have to in a more informal setting. The issue of informal settlements in cities, particularly in fast-developing cities, has always been there in history. As far as we know, certainly from accounts, and then since we've had records of fast-growing cities, we've had parts of those cities that have been informal, that have been slums of one kind or another. It's been true in Europe, it's been true in the US, and now it's true globally in the cities, particularly of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So I think that certainly if you have an appreciation for architecture and the built environment and the growth and logic of cities, you have to come to informality and informal settlements with a perspective that they are not unnatural. They often are a consequence of many processes that happen in cities. And more to the point, they represent both a set of aspirations and people that want to belong to the city, but are in a state of some limbo between having to do everything themselves and starting to belong to a larger logic of the city and start being connected both physically in terms of streets, infrastructure, and then civically and economically. So I think informal settlements represent that stage in which the city is being formed and individuals are starting to experience an urban life. The trick is that that's not something that gets stuck, but that can change towards creating then cities that work for all, and where the challenges, there are many, of living in informal settlements without services, without often justice, without many kinds of opportunity, are open up and become similar to what other people in other parts of society have. So what we've been doing is to work a lot, so because of all this, I think that it's very important to take slums very seriously as part of the city, but also as something that is in flux, that's changing, that both from the point of view of the aspirations who live there, from the point of view of our societies more generally. So what we've been doing is to, so how does that happen, right? So we have a lot of historical examples about how cities get richer and informal settlements get formalized, but we now have a challenge with the new urban agenda sustainable development goals that we're basically asking that essentially the condition of living in a poor informal settlement is changed in 12 years, right? By 2030, cities should be prosperous, should be equitable, and so that's a very short amount of time for transforming livelihoods as well as the built environment. So I think that the key to realizing fast progress that's good for people is really to have better understanding, and part of that is to have better data or better ways of understanding people's priorities as well as assessing any transformations that happen in each place. So what I've been working with Slum Dwellers International is in creating this evidence. It's part of that process of advocacy that basically they create neighborhood census that describe how people live and what services they may have or not have, and prioritizes their own expression of those problems, for example, to their cities. But besides that, what was interesting as we came in and started our collaboration was to create sort of the type of information that allows us all, whether we're researchers or city officials or slum dwellers, to see the same problem. We call it now to put everybody on the same map, such that we understand the condition of living in different parts of the city, and we also understand how these maps can change to create different cities that are less informal but more to the point, that solve most of the problems of the human condition, of poverty and informality. So this is now the next stage of the work. We have a project called Open Reblock that we're proud of, but still ongoing, which is the idea that you use not only census information about poor neighborhoods, which has been collected now for a long time by many people around the world, mapping that's becoming increasingly easy, but the idea is to use these now in terms of planning tools so that people can actually redesign their neighborhood and redesign it with their city authorities and just basically, fight over and collaborate towards a solution that then can quickly advance what the neighborhood could be. And so the essence of that is to create not only a technical base, but basically to creating the institutional or the political system in which solutions that seem impossible and very political with small p become possible and become tangible and become of common agreement, building trust and civic capacity. So this is the magic of cities. All this networking is necessary. It's conflict prone, but when it can be harnessed is really a great force for change. And I think as we understand cities better, we'll be able to more and more create these processes in ways that create the change that we all want faster. I think the main challenge now for the implementation of the new urban agenda and sustainable development goals is that it's a good aspirational document. I think it's a great challenge for basically our generation. We could imagine that in one generation we could solve most of the problems that have plagued humanity for its entire history. So that's the mandate, right? We have the other issues that we have 12 years, okay? So that's not a lot of time. And I think the main challenge, as I said, is that we don't know how. We know what it is. We increasingly may know how to measure it. We have networks of people, many different kinds of stakeholders that are committed to the problem, you know, from slum dwellers to city governments to citizens at large to academics to many urbanist thinkers. But we don't know how to coordinate all our knowledge and action to create change that is of a different kind from the urban planning that we had before, that's basically centered on individual and a process of human development. I think we're building it as we go, and I think that we now have the tools and increasingly the networks of people to create that change. But they still need to be better organized and harnessed. But the only way to do this is to do it in a way that creates essentially an exponential process where networks of people can collaborate and learn from each other quickly and create change that has traction, that's based on evidence, that's based on evidence-based assessments, and that then creates lessons that happen in many different places that can be copied to some extent, but then adapted to a context-specific way that create the change that people want. So in many ways, we're looking at a process of worldwide co-design of our cities, which is in many ways a great sort of utopia, but something that finally is possible because of the global character of urbanization, of the convergent nature of the human condition in the 21st century in cities, and the kind of technologies that we've produced over the last 20 years, which are informational and about communications.